Welcome to day number 2 of this web-based conference, Improving Climate Journalism, Engaging the Youth. This is a message to the non-Norwegian in English first, because this first session will be in Norwegian. But at 10:15, we will get back to the program in English, and we will start at 10:15 with a panel. Web-based conference, Improving Climate Journalism, Engaging the Youth. This is a message to non-Norwegian in English. We will back program in English, and we start at 10:15 with a panel. Sorry. Right. Sorry for this. There was a delay with the stream and everything, so we got the sound here. Okay, but I think that was their very first mishap during this conference, so I hope you forgive us. Anyway, for the English-speaking audience, at 10:15 we will start in English again. Så, da skal vi over til norsk, fordi at vi snakket mye I går om visuelle verktøy som man kunne bruke I klimajournalistikken for å forbedre den. Men det jo mange andre verktøy som journalister trenger, og vi veldig glad for at Miljødirektoratet har ønsket å komme og si litt om de ulike verktøyene de har for å kunne hjelpe klimajournalistikken. Ja, da spesielt I Norge. Et av de verktøyene blant annet hvordan man kan evaluere klimapolitikk lokalt, for eksempel. Klimajournalistikk handler jo også om det. Så vi har jo hatt litt med Miljødirektoratet før. Jeg har vært gleden av å treffe Øyunn, som skal snakke først I flere sammenhenger. Så jeg overlater til dere å snakke. Det også Reidar som skal snakke fra Miljødirektoratet. Det da mulighet til å komme med spørsmål I chatten, som jeg skal enten formidle underveis, eller etter hvert. Så vær så god, Øyunn. Du skal ha en presentasjon.
Takk for at vi fikk lov til å komme. Jeg heter altså Øyunn, og I dag har jeg med meg Reidar, som dere skal få treffe nå litt etter hvert. Vi jobber begge I kommunikasjonsavdelingen, og skal I dag da snakke litt om den store databasen vi har på miljø- og klimadata. Vi jobber jo med veldig mye av dette på feltet, alt fra fiskeoppdrett til stor industri, til naturmangfold, truede arter, klimagassutslipp og FNs klimapanel, for å nevne noe av det vi gjør. Og vi har daglig kontakt med pressen. Vi får massevis av spørsmål, som vi veldig glade for. Men vi ser også at I mange tilfeller så det en del av de tingene som blir spurt om, som ligger tilgjengelig på nettet allerede. Og målet vårt I dag egentlig å bidra til å vise frem en del av de tingene som allerede ligger ute på nett, som vi ønsker at journalistene skal bruke mer. Og vi ser også at flere og flere redaksjoner satser på klima og miljø, og har dedikerte klimajournalister og redaksjoner, noe som veldig bra, og vi ønsker å hjelpe dem til å skrive så gode saker som mulig. Fordi de utfordringene som vi står overfor I dag, de ekstremt komplekse, og forskningen bygger på en del usikkerhet, mye fordi vi ofte snakker om fremtiden når vi snakker om klimautfordringene. Og vi ser også veldig mye I våre sosiale mediekanaler og andre steder at debatten utrolig polarisert, som dere sikkert kjenner til selv. Det veldig mange meninger, dette påvirker folk på veldig mange ulike plan. Og dessverre så det også veldig mye fake news der ute. Og det viser også hvor viktig det med solide og troverdige kilder til informasjon. Og vi altså en uavhengig fagetat, og vi bygger vår klimakunnskap på det som står I rapportene til FNs klimapanel. Vi knutepunkt for FNs klimapanel I Norge, som vil si at vi det nasjonale kontaktpunktet inn I FNs klimapanel. Og sammen med våre samarbeidspartnere så sitter vi på utrolig mye nyttig informasjon som både tilgjengelig og som vi veldig gjerne ønsker at dere skal bruke. Og noe veldig lett tilgjengelig, og andre ting kanskje litt mer kompliserte. Og I den jungelen av informasjon og kilder som finnes, så det ikke så lett å navigere. Så målet vårt I dag da å vise dere litt rundt I noen av våre verktøy og databaser og tjenester som kan brukes inn I journalistisk arbeid. Og så det, som det ble sagt, mulig å stille spørsmål underveis, fordi Reidar kommer også til å vise oss litt faktisk, altså konkret inn I tjenestene, og da det fint at det kommer spørsmål. Så hva det vi egentlig har av tjenester? Vi har for eksempel noe som heter naturbase, som en tjeneste som viser ulike naturtyper og arter og masse annet. Vi har klimatiltak I Norge, som en tjeneste som viser effekten av ulike klimatiltak I ikke-kvotepliktig sektor. Vi har kommunefordelte klimagassutslipp, som en tjeneste som bryter ned utslippene til kommunenivå. Vi har luftkvalitet I Norge, som en slags værmeldingstjeneste for luftkvaliteten. Vi har miljøstatus, som en oversikt over miljøets faktiske tilstand I Norge, med oversikt over hvordan vi ligger an til å nå miljømålene våre, og kart som viser alt fra forurensning til avfall og kulturminner. Og dette bare en liten del av det vi har ute på nett. Så kommer man til spørsmålet. Hvordan skal vi egentlig bruke disse tjenestene inn I journalistikken? Så I dag så har vi valgt ut 4 tjenester som vi ønsker å gå litt mer inn I, og som vi tenker nyttig for dere å vite om og kunne navigere litt rundt I. Og så skal vi også vise noen eksempler på hvordan de brukt I nyhetssaker før. Så da begynner vi med miljøstatus, som en side vi veldig stolte av. Miljøstatus et samarbeid mellom flere statlige etater, hvor vi den ansvarlige redaktøren. Det veldig mange bidragsytere, som Fiskeridirektoratet, Statistisk sentralbyrå, Norsk Polarinstitutt, Havforskningsinstituttet, for å nevne noen av dem. Så her det en liten skjermdump fra forsiden, som delt inn I 12 hovedområder, som naturområder på land, klima, friluftsliv, polarområdene, kulturminner, stråling, avfall, forurensning og støy, miljøgifter, arter, hav og kyst og ferskvann. Og som dere ser på forsiden, så det da på disse hovedområdene trukket ut noen viktige nøkkeltall, som sier noe om tilstanden på det hovedområdet.
Øyen, du må share screen.
For eksempel at 25 kommuner gjorde tiltak mot radioaktiv forurensning I sau I 2019, som under stråling. Og så siden bygd opp, sånn at når du kommer inn på et av hovedområdene, så kan du se Deler jeg ikke? Det sant? Ok. Ja, der ja. Jeg fikk ikke den beskjeden før nå. Jeg har ikke vist så mange slides, heldigvis. Skal vi se. Da ser dere det. Ja. Så her disse nøkkeltallene som jeg snakket om. Jeg må kanskje flytte den litt sånn. Så når dere trykker inn på disse hovedområdene, så kan dere da se en fane for tilstanden. Hvordan står det til med dette området nå? Hva det som påvirker det? Hvilke negativ påvirkning har vi på området? Hvilke konsekvenser har den påvirkningen? Og hvilke tiltak gjøres eller bør gjøres for å bedre tilstanden? Og her har vi et eksempel med polarområdene, hvor dere øverst her ser da tilstand, påvirkning, konsekvenser og tiltak. Så inne på miljøstatus så det vanvittig mye statistikk og tall om klima og miljø. Vi har kjempegrundige og nyttige kart som Reidar skal vise dere mer nå etterpå. Vi har masse grafikk som fritt til å brukes så lenge man krediterer. Og vi har også mulighet til å laste ned, trekke ut data og tall, sånn at dere kan lage deres egen grafikk også. Og vi har en oversikt over miljøets tilstand på hovedområdene og underområdene våre, og hvordan vi ligger an til å nå miljømålene. Så det verdt å nevne at I løpet av høsten så kommer det en samleside hvor alle miljødata samles, og dere kan laste ned alle datasettene som API-er, Vi ser jo også i større grad at redaksjoner og journalister har dedikerte folk som jobber med å visualisere ting, som også var tema i går. Og ved at dere kan trekke ut dataen, så kan dere lage det og integrere det i deres nettsider og nyhetssider med deres egen touch, eget design på det. Så tenkte jeg bare vise dere noen korte eksempler på saker hvor miljøstatus brukt som kilde. Her det en sak i Aftenposten om hvordan landbruket skal bli klimavennlig. Og her har de da sett på sektorfordelte klimagassutslipp i Norge og laget inn til sitt eget diagram, og også klimagassutslipp fra norsk landbruk. Her en annen sak fra Klassekampen, hvor de også har sett på klimagassutslipp fra de ulike sektorene, fra oss og Statistisk sentralbyrå. Her en litt annen sak på NRK, som handler om hvor mye villmark vi har i Norge nå, kontra hvor mye villmark vi hadde i år 1900. Så vi har da har de brukt disse bildene fra miljøstatus. Og så den siste også en klimagass. Sak på ABC-TV med hva problemet med menneskelig klimagassutslipp. Og nå så dere at flere av disse eksemplene handlet om klimagasser, og det jo klart at det skrives veldig mye om klimagasser nå, fordi det et veldig hett tema som alle opptatt av, men det også verdt å merke seg, sånn som med saken om villmark, at vi har veldig masse annet interessant også på miljøstatus. Så nå skal Reidar vise dere litt mer inni selve miljøstatus, og da det bare å stille spørsmål underveis hvis dere vil at han skal vise noe eller lurer på noe konkret.
Hei. Vi skal vise litt om miljøstatus, som jo et veldig viktig nettsted for oss. Og en av oppgavene for oss i Miljødirektoratet å legge til rette informasjon og kunnskap og data som vi får fram. Og vi legger det til rette via nettstedet Miljøstatus, som Øyvind har. Dette inngangen til Miljøstatus. 12 hovedområder, masse informasjon under.
Reidar, virker som du også muta nå. Øyvind, har du muta begge?
Det masse informasjon å hente som du kan plukke ut.
Reidar, kan du høre meg?
Vi ønsker jo selvfølgelig at dette blir brukt. Og vi ønsker å bli kikket i kortet på det vi holder på med, på godt og vondt. Det som går bra, og det som nødvendigvis ikke går så bra. Og nettstedet Miljøstatus har jo også en oversikt over Norges miljømål. For det jo sånn at Norge har 23 miljømål, politisk vedtatt. Men vi og de andre miljøetatene de som forteller om status for miljømålet. Går det bra? Går det mindre bra? Og du kan jo se alle miljømålene, og klikke deg inn og lese om status, og finne alle data om dette, fordelt på disse områdene som Du kan også finne masse informasjon i kart på miljøstatus, der du kan se informasjonen, og du kan gjenbruke dataene hvis du ønsker det. En av de tingene vi har for eksempel på naturmangfold, der du kan se hvordan hva slags naturmangfold det rundt der jeg bor, eller de stedene jeg ønsker å finne, enten fylke, kommune eller detaljert. Nå vi på Helsby, der øyen og jeg befinner oss i dag. Så dette informasjon om natur rundt på Helsby. Du kan klikke deg inn på de punktene som der vi ser at på Østre Gravlund så finnes det en del informasjon om naturmangfold, eller andre områder. Du kan via kart også finne informasjon, for eksempel her, om landbasert industri i Norge. Hvor de? Og her vi da utenfor Kristiansund på Kjellbergodden. Der ligger blant annet Kjellbergodden metanolfabrikk og en del andre industri, som du da kan lese mer om, og kommer da videre til nettstedet vårt, Norske Utslipp, som inneholder mye informasjon, blant annet om Kjellbergodden metanolfabrikk. Du finner tillatelsen som gitt etter forurensningsloven. Du finner de kontrollene som Miljødirektoratet har utført. Informasjon om vannovervåkninga. En rekke virksomheter i Norge skal jo også ha krav til klimakvoter. Det finner du. Du finner utslippsdata på ulike typer stoffer fra, i dette tilfellet, Kjellbergodden. Og du finner mange totale utslipp. Og du finner da også den tillatelsen som virksomheten har etter forurensningsloven som vi regulerer. Så det var et oppspark til Øyunn som skal fortelle mer om norske utslipp.
Sånn. Da
Svarer på noen spørsmål.
Tror jeg det kommet noen spørsmål?
Ikke noen spørsmål foreløpig.
Nei. Så går vi videre til norske utslipp, som da Reidar viste litt grann, som da den neste tjenesten vi tenker nyttig for dere å vite om. Og her tenkte jeg å begynne med et eksempel. Og det var sånn jeg ble kjent med norske utslipp nå i sommer, for da hadde Klassekampen en lang nyhetsserie hvor de så da på antall ulovlige utslipp i petroleumsbransjen og i landbasert industri. Og vi hadde da en tett dialog med dem underveis, og de brukte da norskeutslipp.no til å få tak i de tallene som de har bygd denne saken på. Denne saken fikk jo stor spredning og ble også satt på en politisk agenda. Og det som litt interessant med det at det de skrev om var jo egentlig tilgjengelig og åpent for alle, men det var ingen andre som hadde sett på dataen på den måten før og gjort dette gravearbeidet. Så det sier noe om det potensialet i data som allerede ligger fritt tilgjengelig. Så norske utslipp.no altså en oversikt over alle utslipp. Sånn som det ser ut her, så ser det kanskje litt vanskelig ut inne på siden. Og derfor det fint å ha sett det en gang, så at man vet hvordan man skal navigere. For det ganske greit når man har vært inne der og prøvd litt. Og da i den saken jeg nevnte i stad, Klassekampen, så de altså på utslipp fra petroleumsanlegg og landbasert industri, og som Reidar var inne på, så kan man jo sortere på ulike stoffer og miljøgifter, men også inn på ulike virksomheter, sånn som at du kan gå inn på en bestemt oljeplattform og se på de årlige utslippene de har hatt der. Du kan også se om det er utslipp til luft eller til sjø, og det er altså da basert på de årlige rapportene fra industrien. Og når det gjelder andre sektorer, så er de som ikke da har krav om rapportering av utslipp, så beregnes utslippene på bakgrunn av aktivitetsdata og utslippsfaktorer, så det er for eksempel for husholdninger, utslippene derfra. Norske utslipp.no viser også en oversikt over tildelte klimakvoter og kvotepliktige utslipp. Også inne på de ulike sektorene så er det sånn veldig godt forklart da, hva man kan se av utslipp, hva man eventuelt ikke kan se. Så er det også verdt å nevne at det gjøres et arbeid nå med å utvikle disse sidene for å gjøre de enda bedre og lettere tilgjengelig for bruk også utenfor de som sitter og jobber spesifikt med dette her til hverdags. Så nå skal Reidar igjen få vise litt mer av hvordan man kan navigere seg i tjenesten.
For norske utslipp.no inneholder svært mye informasjon som du kan drille deg ned i på den måten du vil. Jeg bare komme inn av den. For eksempel om petroleumsvirksomhet til havs. Det er sånn at det er ca. 87 anlegg på norsk sokkel i dag, eller felt som det også blir betegnet som. Alle områdene skal ha en tillatelse til forurensningsloven. Den tillatelsen er vi i Miljødirektoratet som behandler. Og informasjonen om tillatelsen og utslippene fra alle feltene på norsk sokkel finner du på norske utslipp. Du kan se på hovedtallet. Du kan filtrere, for eksempel gå inn på feltet Balder, som blir operert av vår energi, som jo har blitt et av de større operatørselskapene på norsk sokkel, og finne utslippstall for dette feltet. Se tid. Vi har data til 20 år tilbake. Du kan gå inn og se virksomheten på kart. Du kan sammenstille data med ulike felt. Du kan finne alle utslipp fra vår energi, alle feltene vi har, og så videre. Så det var litt om norske utslipp, og de ulike sektorene finner du i venstremenyen. Det er landbasert industri, som vi var innom, en av de viktige, men du finner også de andre områdene som avløpsrenseanlegg og landbruk som Øyunn nevnte. Og her finnes det mye data som man også kan laste ned og gjenbruke i sin form.
Den neste tjenesten vi har lyst til å vise dere er den som heter Luftkvalitet, som er en varslingstjeneste. Denne tjenesten den kom i fjor, og den er også integrert hos yr.no. Og den er et samarbeid mellom Miljødirektoratet, Statens vegvesen, Meteorologisk institutt, Folkehelseinstituttet og Helsedirektoratet, som står sammen bak luftkvalitet i Norge. Og her også tenkte jeg å begynne med et lite eksempel. fra Bergens Tidende, tror jeg det hvor Victor da får sjekke om han bør holde seg unna Bergens sentrum, da denne varslingstjenesten kom. Og dette jo interessant for Victor, fordi han i risikogruppen med astma. Og det jo en måte man kan finne lokale vinklinger på den type ting. Fordi poenget med luftkvalitet i Norge jo å bidra til at publikum får vite hvordan luftkvaliteten der de bor og oppholder seg, og det skal bli enklere å unngå å utsette seg for lokal luftforurensning. Og da det spesielt relevant da for disse sårbare gruppene, som de med hjerte- og lungesykdommer, barn og gravide og eldre. Og også et annet poeng med tjenesten at kommunen skal få oversikt over luftkvaliteten i sin kommune, og finne ut hvilken del av luftforurensningen som utfordringen, og hvor kommer det fra, sånn at de kan vite hva man kan gjøre for å redusere luftforurensningen, og dermed også oppfylle da sin plikt til å informere befolkningen om den lokale luftkvaliteten. Her ser vi også en skjermdump av luftkvalitet i Norge. Her ser dere grønt, det lite luftforurensning nå i Oslo. Det jo veldig bra. Så kan vi også søke etter ulike steder og områder og så videre, og se på kart og lese om hvilken helserisiko det med den luftkvaliteten som varslet. Og så det jo mange ting som spiller inn for luftkvalitet. Det mye veitrafikk for eksempel, så kan man få dårlig luftkvalitet, været spiller inn, og derfor det jo noen steder som mer utsatt enn andre. Og her ser dere også den varslede luftforurensningen, og det også da ganske likt som et værvarsel, så vi liker på en måte å si at det som værvarsel for luftkvalitet. Så det jo litt typisk at denne skjermdumpen jeg har valgt, så det helt strålende luft alle steder. Så her det trygt å ferdes overalt, rett og slett. Da skal også Reidar vise litt mer av denne tjenesten. Skal vi se. Sånn.
Det jo sånn at den perioden det størst sjanse for dårligere luft ulike steder i Norge, det på vinteren. Ofte ved start i november og frem til mars-april, da det flest hendelser med dårlig luftkvalitet, som Øyvind viste. Det bare grønt i de største byene som dratt fram på forsiden av luftkvalitet i Norge. Men du som kan finne ditt område som du ønsker å se på, enten uavhengig av hvor det i Norge. Så det jo denne inndelingen som legges til grunn. Alt nå lite av de største byene, og så kan det være ulike nivåer som har betydning. På neste sted så finner du også en del informasjon, faktainformasjon om luftforurensning, hvordan vi måler og varsler, og hvordan dette foregår, og det samarbeidet som da mellom oss og Meteorologisk Folkehelse, Vegvesen og Helsedirektoratet. Sånn. Da skal vi bare dele igjen. Så i Oslo så kan du se værvarselet på kart. Nå det bare grønt. Men dette jo, og hvis du lurer på hvordan det blir i morgen formiddag, så kan du dra deg fram og se. Det blir grønt i morgen også. Men du kan også da se de ulike områdene i Oslo. Og du kan finne ut hvor egentlig disse målestasjonene. Dette hvor de står hen i Oslo. Så det jo sånn at YR gjenbruker informasjonen fra luftkvalitet i Norge. Dette jo da den gamle nettsida til YR som de I ferd med å skifte ut. Vil du ha en forsmak på de nye nettsidene? Ja, det vil vi. Fordi at på de nye nettsidene til YR, som nå på vei inn, nå viser vi da været på Helsfyr. Fortsatt der øyen og jeg Og her vil du da finne informasjon om luftforurensninger rundt Helsfyr, basert på data fra luftkvalitet i Norge. Dette jo et API som tilgjengelig, som alle kan bruke. Og slike API-er har vi da fra de ulike tjenestene våre, som gjør at det datauttrekket du vil ha, enten om det kan leveres via dette API-et inn på ditt eget nettsted, hvis du interessert I det.
Da vi faktisk kommet til den siste av de 4 tjenestene vi hadde lyst til å vise frem I dag. Og denne heter klimagassutslipp I kommuner. Og denne tjenesten også mye brukt I media, spesielt da når tallene blir tilgjengelige en gang I året. Og her 2 eksempler på det. Og det også I 2018 så ble det mye blest da disse tallene ble brukt inn I lokalvalgkampen, hvor da de ulike partiene brukte disse klimagassutslippene for å si noe om at de kommunene som ble styrt av deres partier hadde høyere nedgang I klimagassutslipp enn de kommunene som ble styrt av de motstridende partiene. Så da endte det I en sak på faktisk.no, hvor de da kunne slå fast at det faktisk ikke var helt sikkert at det bare var fortjenesten til politikerne som gjorde at det var lavere utslipp I de kommunene som de styrte I da.
Øyunn, kan jeg stille et spørsmål?
Ja.
Du bare om det der, for det der slår meg som et viktig poeng sånn generelt da, så når dere måler utslipp og har tall og sånt, I hvilken grad kreves det mye fortolkning og sånt av de tallene på utslipp på kommunene, sånn at for at man, spesielt I valgkamp, så kan man jo vinkle tall og klimagassutslipp på forskjellige måter, ikke sant? Så kan man også snakke med dere om tolkningen av de tallene.
Absolutt, og det skjer veldig ofte også at folk kontakter oss og sier om hva betyr det at de utslippene kommer fra den sektoren, det derfor, og så videre og så videre. Og det også krever mye arbeid fra vår side med beregninger på å brekke ned disse utslippene på et kommunenivå. Og det også det utfordringen I statistikk og tall som du nevner da, og som skjedde her, at man kan jo da velge for eksempel å klippe ut bare en liten del av en graf, som gjør at det ser ut som en større endring enn det egentlig for eksempel. Så det ser jo vi mye på de tallene vi presenterer da, at det hender at de brukes for å få frem poenger da, som egentlig ikke vi har sagt da. Så kan du vel legge til noe til det der?
Vi helt klart interessert I å bistå og hjelpe alle som har et behov. Vårt ønske jo bruk av tallene og bistå for å forklare de faktiske tallene, og så det jo da som gjør at journalister og andre kan få en god forståelse og bruke det inn I sine artikler slik de ønskes selv. Vi her for å bidra til faktagrunnlag og så litt jo noen ganger grunn rundt hva egentlig faktagrunnlaget som våre fagfolk gjerne bistår med.
Her ser dere også en skjermdump fra nettsiden. Her ser dere altså søkefeltet hvor du kan søke på kommuner eller fylker, og da vil du få noen nøkkeltall om det stedet du befinner deg på. For eksempel her har vi Larvik, da står det litt om hvor stor kommunen og hvor mange som bor der, og hvordan endringen deres har vært i prosent i klimagassutslipp, og hvor mange de hadde totalt. Så kan man også sortere på 9 ulike sektorer, som dere ser her, så dere kan se hvor stor del som er fordelt på ulike utslippskilder. Og denne siden her, den viser utslipp fra CO2, metan og lystgass. Her ser dere også litt mer i detalj de sektorfordelte utslippene per år. Og her befinner vi oss da i Asker. Og så kan dere jo se at de ulike sektorene, de har ulike farger på grafen her. Og du ser også at her har det gått nedover, stort sett da, fra 2009. Og at den største utslippskilden i Asker er veitrafikk. Så kan man da for eksempel se at den andelen utslipp som kommer fra industri, olje og gass, den har jo da nesten forsvunnet, akkurat i dette eksempelet. Og så det verdt å nevne at her det disse tallene blir tilgjengelige etter at de nasjonale tallene presentert, for da må vi gå inn og se og brekke disse tallene ned, jobbe med disse tallene for å kunne fordele dem riktig på kommunene, og derfor det på en måte en tidsintervall da, mellom disse tallene, så du vil henge på en måte 1 år etter, så i 2020 så fikk vi tallene for 2018, om det gir mening. Så det ikke helt ideelt, men det allikevel en tjeneste som veldig, veldig nyttig for å si noe om trenden og utviklingen i kommunene. Så nå skal Reidar også vise litt mer om denne tjenesten.
Det jo sånn at de nasjonale tallene for utslipp av klimagasser i Norge får jo da via Statistisk sentralbyrå, som kommer 2019-tallet foreløpig kommer jo i sommer. De tallene finner du da også via miljøstatus i de grafene som jeg viste i stad. Men denne tjenesten her jo utslipp av klimagasser i kommuner og fylker, der du kan drille deg ned og finne ditt fylke eller din kommune. Øyen viste jo Larvik, så her Larvik. Vi på det samme igjen at dette grafen. Du finner de samme tallene i en tabell. Holder du musa over, så finner du en fordeling på tallene på de ulike årene på de ulike utslippssektorene. Du finner de igjen i tabell. Du kan laste ned hvis det bilde, og du kan laste ned datagrunnlaget hvis du ønsker det. Du kan også gjøre sammenligninger mellom kommuner. Siden jeg opprinnelig fra Sandefjord, så måtte jeg jo dra fram Sandefjord som nabokommunen til Larvik, for å se hvordan ligger an mellom Larvik og Sandefjord. Viser seg at Sandefjord har større utslipp enn Larvik. Nå har jo Sandefjord blitt en større kommune enn Larvik også, med flere innbyggere. Så her kunne den analysert litt mer. Hva utslippskildene i de to forskjellige byene, og da spurt de to kommunene hva jobber de med for å få redusert utslippene. Og det kunne tenkes at selv om det større i Sandefjord, at hvis man hadde kikket på året tilbake igjen, at utslippene der på vei mer ned enn i Larvik, eller på vei opp. Så det mye muligheter der for å finne ut av i sitt område, enten 2 eller flere kommuner, eller kommunene i sitt fylke eller område.
Reidar, kan jeg stille et spørsmål?
Ja.
Du, det her jo viktig å tenke å få klimagassutslipp knyttet til hver kommune, og hvis man kan lage lokalkonkurranse mellom Larvik og Sandefjord og sånn, så må jo det være et bra poeng å lage saker rundt i forhold til hva man gjør lokalt. Men jeg ser jo det at veitrafikken jo en svær bolk, både her som vi søsker og sånt. Jeg bare lurer på hvordan dere klarer å knytte utslipp av veitrafikken til enkeltområder, om hvor mye man kan gjøre bare i Larvik, eller bare i Sandefjord, eller bare i Asker. Altså kjører ikke folk gjennom alle de her plassene og sånn, så hvordan klarer dere å ansvarliggjøre de lokale veiutslippene?
Det jo klart at det et viktig poeng som du tar opp, men det finnes jo da statlige veier, fylkesveier og kommunale veier. Og det klart at for en kommune å påvirke utslippet fra den statlige veien mer krevende, sånn som E18 som går på utsida av Sandefjord og Larvik, for eksempel. Men den har jo de virkemidlene for kommunen. Og det jo slik at kommunen forurensningsmyndighet for luftkvalitet, som vi inne på i stedet med luftkvalitet i Norge, og har ganske mange virkemidler etter forurensningsforskriften for å få til endringer for bedre luft. Jeg kan si at nå prater vi nå om utslipp av klimagasser, men utslipp av stoffer til luft som gir dårlig luftkvalitet har jo ofte en sammenheng også kan være med klimagasser. Men det jo da, hvis man ønsker å gå inn på det, hva disse forskjellige kategoriene som Larvik har? Hvilke kategorier det mulig for Larvik å gjøre noe med? Og hvilke utenfor kommunens kontroll eller mulighet som de bare da kan sparke over til oss og politikerne for å få redusert. Vi har også en lignende tjeneste for utslipp og opptak fra skog- og arealbruk. Den mer komplisert, men det jo sånn at skogen en viktig tiltak for å redusere utslipp av klimagasser, siden de tar opp CO2. Hvordan vi bruker arealene også viktig. Dyrka mark, beite, vann og myr, kanskje for mer spesielt interesserte, men her finner du også, her vi fortsatt på Larvik, og kan se litt på utviklingen i Larvik på hvordan det går. Og her også det noen analysemuligheter om hvordan vi bygger i vår kommune. Hva betyr det for utslippet av klimagasser? Bygger vi ned dyrka mark? Hvordan bruker vi arealene? Så her finnes det også mye data, men litt vanskeligere tilgjengelig. Men der finnes det gode fagfolk i Miljødirektoratet som gjerne bistår for å si noe rundt dette. For dette også et viktig område i Norges kamp for å få redusert utslipp av klimagasser. Så det var vår siste visning, Øyvind.
Og til slutt så nå har vi vist frem 4 av de tjenestene vi tenker viktigst at dere vet om, og som dere tenker på å søke i, hvis dere skal lage en sak om noen av disse temaene. Men vi har jo også en del andre tjenester vi ikke har fått gått gjennom i dag, som dere ser her på denne siste sliden. Og da har vi jo noen av de jeg nevnte I sted, som naturbase, om arter og naturmangfold og naturtyper. Og så har vi en som heter Mulig klimatiltak I Norge, som en ganske ny tjeneste, som basert på Klimakur og tiltakene I ikke-kvotepliktig sektor, så man kan teste effekten av å gjennomføre ulike tiltak for å få ned klimagassutslippene. Så har vi laksregistre, alt om laks, og lakseelver, rovbase og hjorteviltregistre, tilsvarende om disse gruppene dyr, grunnforurensning, om hvordan forurenset grunn I Norge, og miljøvedtaksregistre som viser da enkeltvedtak som vi gir til saker og ting. Så dere har fått litt innblikk I hva som vi kan hjelpe dere med, og så vi alltid tilgjengelig som helst om dere jobber med noe og vil ha bistand eller har noen spørsmål. Så til slutt, det noen andre som har noen spørsmål eller noen andre ting de vil vi skal vise? Vi har litt tid igjen.
Ja, det et spørsmål her. Kommer det forslag om klimatiltak fra dere? Eller det innspill fra kommuner og politikere som det handler om?
Til syvende og sist så det politikerne som vedtar hvilke klimatiltak Norge skal sette I verk. Så det som jo har vært, var jo at Miljødirektoratet og noen andre etater la fram Klimakur 2030 tidligere I år, som en oversikt over mulige klimatiltak I Norge, med en beregning av hvor store utslipp du kan få, og hvor mye det vil koste. Og når vi fikk det oppdraget fra regjeringen, så var det tydelig på at vi ikke skulle gi en anbefaling om sette I verk sånn og sånn tiltak, men å lage en meny for hvilke tiltak som mulig. Og det har jo vært en del debatt rundt Klimakur. Den inneholder blant annet noe knyttet til landbruk, eller inneholder egentlig alle områder I Norge, inkludert landbruk. Rødt kjøtt og så videre som har vært fremme. Men utslipp knyttet til industri på land og til havs og så videre. Den Klimakur har jo da blitt behandlet og jobbet med av de ulike departementene. Og regjeringen har jo sagt at det kommer en stortingsmelding om klimatiltak nå I løpet av året. Og Erna Solberg sa jo det sist nå knyttet til statsbudsjettet om at forslag til klimatiltak fra regjeringen kommer nå I løpet av høsten. Som jo da en melding som går til Stortinget, og Stortinget skal endelig vedta nye klimatiltak for Norge. Men vi viser fram hvilke klimatiltak som mulig gjennom den tjenesten. Og du kan sette sammen din egen pakke med klimatiltak for å jobbe med hvordan Norge skal nå sine klimamål, og da samtidig se hva det vil koste.
Hvis dere skal likevel anbefale, det jo ikke alle råd fra Miljødirektoratet som alltid blir fulgt opp, kan vi kanskje si, sånn generelt. Men det et spørsmål her også om, hvis dere skal anbefale journalister ut ifra de her databasene om hvilke typer klimasaker som bør dekkes, eller kan bli dekket, eller som kan bli usynlige av og til. Noe spesielt dere vil anbefale her? Det flere av studentene på klimajournalistikk her som ser og hører på og sånt også her.
Det et godt spørsmål som jeg skulle ønske at vi hadde laget en liste på, som jeg kunne ramse opp nå. Men Øyunn?
Nei, jeg tenker jo at det jo, vet ikke, hadde vi visst det, så hadde vi jo kanskje antageligvis laget en sak på oss selv, tenker jeg. Men det jo litt det å følge med på temaer da, som kanskje ikke blir dekt så mye, og gå inn og lese hva det som finnes her for eksempel. Så vi har jo oversikt på veldig mange ting som man kan grave mer I når du har da altså for eksempel en oversikt på avfall I Norge, for eksempel, og det jo ikke en sak I seg selv, men hvis man går inn og ser på hva som finnes av statistikk om avfall, så kanskje får man noen ideer. Så jeg ville sjekke det på miljøstatus, for eksempel, og bare lest litt om de temaene jeg kanskje ikke visste så mye om fra før av, og sett på hva som fantes av data, og så ser man kanskje fikk noen ideer, eller lærte noe man ikke visste, som man kan bygge videre på.
Ja, men du sa det at dere lager saker selv. Jeg bare prøver å forestille meg når dere sitter og setter sammen de her tallene, når dere kanskje har oversikt over ting som omtrent ingen egentlig andre har oversikt over. Hender det dere blir irritert over at her sitter dere på ting som egentlig veldig viktig, og så det bare rett og slett ingen som tar tak I det og sånt. Og hva gjør man da hvis man sitter som en fagansvarlig på skog eller på vei eller et eller annet sånt, og så bare gremmes år ut og år inn, liksom? Altså, hvor ofte tar dere å løfte frem de tingene som lavthengende frukter eller viktige saker som liksom burde hatt offentlighetens interesse, men som da kanskje ikke blir plukket opp, og som dere må lage pressemelding på. Kan du si litt om hvordan dere velger å pushe saker ut ifra den databasen dere har?
I for eksempel norske utslipp.no kommer jo med oppdaterte utslippstall hvert år fra alle landbaserte virksomheter I Norge, og alle petroleumsvirksomheter til havs. Som vi prøver å pushe ut og vise frem som det kunne godt vært mer bruk av. Hvilke utslipp fra landbasert industri I min kommune? Hvor stort det? Går det ned? Hvordan det med de ulike virksomhetene? Så det et eksempel. Norske utslipp av mange andre kategorier på hvordan går det med utslippene fra avløp I mitt område. Hvorfor går det opp, for eksempel, eller ned, som jo også skjer I en del tilfeller. Hvordan status for Norges miljømål, som jo delt inn I 6 resultatområder. For eksempel på naturmangfold eller på klima. Hvorfor det en har prøvd å si som målet, hvorfor går det ikke bedre enn det gjør? Eller på noen andre områder, hvorfor har han greid å oppnå det? På vi prøver jo å nå ut med sånne saker både gjennom meldinger og informasjon som vi legger til rette I ulike kanaler, eller som vi prøver å si fra direkte om til journalister I ulike enten nasjonale, regionale eller kommunale.
Altså, dere tar kontakt direkte av og til med redaksjoner dere vet kan noe om enkelte områder og enkeltjournalister og sånt, og sier at det her vil vi gjerne synes det kunne være grunn til å belyse.
Ja, absolutt, og noen ting jo også veldig relevant for litt mindre steder eller lokalaviser og den type ting da, og kanskje ikke for de større nasjonale avisene. Men til det du spurte om ja, det noen ganger litt kjedelig, og når man føler at man selv sitter på noe gull som alle burde vite om, men som ingen interessert I å skrive om. Det absolutt noe vi må forholde oss til innimellom.
Så vi har jo fått tilbakemeldinger fra journalister om at vi må bli flinke til å si fra direkte om saker, så det jobber vi med, og for å gjøre det av interessante saker I enkeltområder, regionalt eller kommunalt. Fordi at det finnes mye gull, det finnes mye data som man kan ta utgangspunkt I for å lage interessante saker, og vi har fagfolk som kan tegne og forklare, eventuelt andre etater. Miljøstatus inneholder jo blant annet også kulturminner, for Riksantikvaren jo en del av miljøforvaltningen innunder Klima- og miljødepartementet, så de med på miljøstatus, og der finnes det en del interessante ting som man kan se på I sitt område om kulturminner. Polarområdene jo med, nå kan du si at det Svalbard, Arktis, og Antarktis. Så treffer jo ikke så mange kommuner. Men det en del interessante ting knyttet til arbeid med det. Og de mer større områdene som naturmangfold og klima. Eller du kan gjøre ting på den jaktstatistikken som for arter som det jaktes på. Eller for eksempel på grunnforurensning, som vi har et eget system over. Der du kan finne alle områder med forurenset grunn i din kommune. Hvordan går det med dem? Hvem har blitt
Gå og sjekke selv.
Og ikke.
Ja, vi begynner å nærme oss slutten. Først bare som praktisk spørsmål. Det har vært kjempefint hvis du kunne sendt en presentasjon også på mail til meg i etterkant, fordi jeg tror at flere av de studentene våre som nå på jobb og som ikke kunne få fylt den sendingen her, og sånn kunne hatt nytte av den oversikten som dere ga. Så det det ene. Og så det bare ett spørsmål til slutt, kanskje. Du nevnte Arktis, Reidar. Det vel kanskje et av de plassene der man har kommet med råd, og som de ikke bestandig har blitt fulgt opp, for å si det forsiktig. Hva gjør dere, og hva gjør eventuelt journalister når de går i kontakt med dere om råd som ikke blir fulgt? Deres jobb på en måte litt over når rådene gitt, eller det sånn at det noen råd som når de da ikke blir fulgt, dere føler et ekstra behov for å kommunisere til offentligheten?
Vi jo veldig godt fornøyd med at vi blir spurt om råd og kan gi det. Men det klart at vi byråkrater, og til syvende og sist så det politikerne som heldigvis skal bestemme i et demokrati som vi har holdt. Så vi fortrolige med at våre råd blir behandlet og sett på, tatt til følge, men igjen, det politikerne som må finne ut av helheten, både kommunalt og fylkesvis og nasjonalt. Og så får vi jo, men vi forteller jo om våre råd og hvorfor vi gir de rådene vi gir. Og i en del tilfeller så gjør jo vi jo også vedtak etter det regelverket som vi har satt til å forvalte. Men alle våre vedtak kan jo da påklages og avgjøres jo da til syvende og sist av Klima- og miljødepartementet. Som et system som vi ser at fungerer på en god måte.
Da takker jeg så mye både til Øyunn og til Reidar. Det var en veldig nyttig og viktig presentasjon. Tar mye ut av denne diskusjonen vi hadde i går om verktøyer og redskaper for klimajournalistikken litt sånn ned på jorda i forhold til hva man faktisk kan gjøre når man lager ganske mange forskjellige saker, som jo da jeg tror både våre studenter og andre journalister trenger å gjøre omkring klima i tida som kommer. Så hjertelig takk til dere begge to. Takk for at dere ble med på denne konferansen. Og så skal jeg gå over til streamen og bare si til litt på engelsk. So we are now leaving the Norwegian part of this conference, and in 15 minutes at 10:15 we will restart again, and we will have the very important debate within journalism in Norway, but probably also internationally, in terms of how to deal with the oil and climate dilemmas in journalism. So tune in again at 10:15 and we'll see you then.
Welcome back to our international audience. We will now proceed with the conference day 2. Hope you are still following us. My name is Ingrid Salvesen, and together with Andreas and a great team, I'm part of organizing this conference. And when I'm not, I work as a journalist and a lecturer. And today I'm happy to be sharing this debate, which will try to answer the question, how can journalism confront the oil and climate dilemma? And what do we mean by this dilemma? For a serious engagement with young people, climate journalism needs to talk about oil, both historically and now with the COVID-19 situation. Oil is both seen as a guarantist for the welfare state, but also as one of the main culprits of runaway global warming. And journalists are increasingly aware of this dilemma. But how should they cover it, and how can they confront it? This is what will be the topic for today's debate. We have with us Geir Ramnefjell, which is the political editor in one of Norway's legacy mainstream newspapers, Dagbladet. We have with us Jannik Lindbekk, head of political and public affairs at Equinor, Norway's biggest oil and gas company, also huge internationally. And as you have seen in the program, we were supposed to have with us Tone Tveistrøm Gundersen from another legacy big newspaper in Norway, Aftenposten. Unfortunately, she could not join us in the last minute, but we will do our best without her. And we would also love to hear from all of you out there. If you have any questions or comments during the debate, please write in the YouTube comments field, and we will include them in our conversation. This is, of course, an international conference, but no worries, because this dilemma is not only a Norwegian one. We have lots of fossil fuel producing and dependent countries that have big climate policy and goals out there. And of course, this is also a world dilemma in one way. So this dilemma is relevant for all of us. And so to start with and send us off with a kind of a cross-national take on this dilemma and also posing some challenges, we have made a pre-recorded interview with Tsepura Berman. She could not join us today. She lives and works in Canada, and it's in the middle of the night. But we did a short interview beforehand. Now, she is an activist and an academic, working on environmental policy in Canada and other countries for over 20 years. She is an adjunct professor at York University and chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, a new initiative that wants to phase out fossil fuels. So I'll play this video and then we'll start the conversation.
It's absolutely critical that we have an informed debate on the role of the oil industry and oil expansion in addressing climate change. Because we need to remember that 80% of the climate problem is because of fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. And my research has shown that it's in part because of the role of fossil fuel companies, especially big oil companies, that is almost not in the debate at all. And what I mean is, I'll never forget the day that I searched through the Paris Accord for the words oil and gas and coal and then fossil fuels. Those words don't even exist in our international climate agreements. And I think that the industry has spent an enormous amount of money, that's clear from research over the past decade, in trying to foster climate denial, in trying to hide their impact and their responsibility for what's happening on climate change. Every company and every country likes to believe that their oil expansion is okay, that they're doing the best, that they have a right to compete. And we see parallels in Canada to what the debate that's happening in Norway. but also in many other regions of increased oil production in Texas, in the United States, in New Mexico, in Argentina. The fact is, we need journalists to be looking at the math, to be looking at the reality. What we know from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and many other reports and scientists around the world is that if we are going to ensure a safe climate, we need to have emissions within the next 10 years. So what that means is that every country and every company needs to be reducing emissions now. So let's look at what the oil industry has been doing and saying. We've seen a lot of commitments over the last couple of months to net zero. And it's great that companies are starting to take these issues seriously. But again, let's look at what they're saying. Net zero is actually providing a way for companies to hide behind the technologies that would pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So tree planting, carbon capture and sequestration, those technologies are essential. That's true, because right now we have 411 parts per million of CO2 trapped in the atmosphere. And we know that a much safer climate level, and our goal, in fact, globally, all of our countries, both of our countries have agreed to, this is a 1.5 degree world, more like 350 parts per million. But the oil companies, all of the big majors, are using the net zero conversation to justify expansion of fossil fuel production. So they make it sound really complicated, but I think that there is a responsibility on behalf of journalists to be looking at the issue of whether companies are expanding production and exploration, and whether or not they're expanding investment in renewables and the solution. So those are two basic measures that show the trajectory of what a company is willing to do. And, you know, at this moment in history, every ton of CO2 matters. And so we need clarity in the public debate about what the companies are doing. And we also need clarity about what our countries, Canada and Norway, are doing and who they're listening to. If you look at the lobby records in both countries, and even yesterday released in the UK, freedom of information documents that the UK government has been meeting with the oil companies to plan for COP26. In Canada, hundreds and hundreds of meetings just since COVID on the stimulus by big oil companies. So these companies are having an undue influence on our countries and how we talk about climate change and oil production and how our governments act. Since 2015, since the Paris Accord was signed, just 5 big oil companies have spent $1 billion lobbying to reduce climate policy and ambition. So I think it's absolutely critical that journalism really look at the math. Is production and emissions going up or down? That's the critical benchmark. And I think the debate is getting very confused by different companies' commitments. And our governments like to say that expanding production is essential. But we know that's not true. We already have enough oil, gas, and coal under production or in the system to use while the world transitions to a renewable and electrified economy. Numerous studies have shown that. Last year, the United Nations Environmental Program and the Stockholm Environment Institute released a report called the Production Gap Report. I think for this conversation, it's the critical piece of research that every journalist should have read. What the Production Gap Report shows is that we are currently on track to produce 120% more oil, gas, and coal that can be safely burned in a 1.5 degree scenario. Why? Are we putting our intellectual, our financial, and our political capital towards producing a product that we know threatens global security. I think those are the critical issues that have to be addressed. And good journalism would address those issues by asking our governments the hard questions of how they're going to reduce emissions and production.
And when you say that good journalism would do that, how would you describe the state of the journalism in Canada and also in Norway, if you can, today? Are journalists doing that job that you are saying that they should be doing?
I think that what we've seen in Canada and also in Norway is falling back on these old, tired narratives. Well, we have to ensure expansion in order to support the economy. That's no longer true. What we know is that oil and gas are performing at the bottom of the S&P index and have been for years. We're seeing more bankruptcies. We're seeing a lower price. We're seeing lower demand. Governments are responsible for looking towards where the economy is going. For that matter, so are corporations. And we need to be ensuring that we're building a strong and resilient economy now, that we're building the infrastructure that the world needs, not just to address climate change, but to reduce air pollution, to reduce the toxics and the toxic load in our water. And in order to do that, we need to ensure that we have a public debate that is based on the facts. And I think what we're seeing in both Canada and Norway is that governments are starting to prop up these companies through increased subsidies, through tax breaks. So as the price of renewable energy has been dropping in many cases around the world, now at price parity with fossil fuel development, what we're seeing is instead of these projects or these companies dying or transforming themselves, we're seeing governments prop them up because of the political influence of these companies. And the fact is that if we're subsidizing oil and gas development, that's taxpayers' dollars that is not going into building the solution and a cleaner and safer future.
To dig into here and to answer to, you will both have the chance to do so. But I thought we should start with the core of her argument, which is the role of journalism in creating a fact-based public debate on this oil and climate dilemma. And Geir Ramnefjell, Berman is saying that journalists should do the math and speak the truth. And her impression is that journalists instead let governments and companies get away with what she calls an old narrative, that fossil fuels are necessary for our economies. Do you agree with that description?
Not entirely. I feel that during the last few years, I can mainly speak for Norway.
You need to turn on your mic, sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. During the last few years, I think that Norwegian journalism has been more critical towards that part of the oil industry and the connection to the economy as a main and as a whole. I feel that maybe like 5 or 10 years ago, when there was news of a big new oil field or breakthrough for one of the companies like Equinor, it was all celebrations and hooray, we're gonna earn lots of new millions of dollars and billions of dollars. But now the debate is pretty soon whether or not this will be a good project for the economy as a whole, whether or not it will be economically viable for the society as a whole and not only for the companies. and that has been a new development in the covering of the oil industry in Norway, which I find very positive, and I think we'll see more of that in the future, and we can talk more about that as well afterwards.
Just a quick follow-up. How do you approach this dilemma as journalists in Dagbladet when you want to cover the oil industry in light of climate change?
Well, that's a big question in many different ways, but just to follow up on what I started talking about, I feel it's more and more important for newspapers and critical journalists to write critical stories on whether the oil projects will be viable economically for the society as a whole and not only for the companies, because I feel that in Norway we don't have a debate whether or not oil and gas is a part of the problem, and Equinor says that they want to reach the Paris targets. Everyone agrees on that. It's a discussion whether or not or the tempo and in what form the build down of the oil industry will take place. And in that light, I feel that it's important that we raise the discussion to not only talk about whether or not oil and gas is a climate problem, but whether or not it is an economical problem for the society as a whole. Because then you engage a larger audience, then you engage this question to matter on state economics, and that is the big argument for oil industry for the next couple of years, or for the next 10 or 20 years. I think so.
Oh.
While you change the microphone, I can continue a little bit. As Tsepora was talking about as well, we have to look also beyond politics. We have to look at what comes after oil and what can be new industrial possibilities for Norway. Tsepora mentioned that oil companies are performing very bad on the stock markets, and right now we see a green boom on the stock markets all over the world, as well as in Norway. It's very apparent that investors all over the world are looking for new projects, green project, renewable projects, and are throwing money at them at the moment. And when we get that picture, when we see that both the climate science and the investors, and also many other politicians and the public as a whole, they want this green transition, we should focus more on the possibilities that lies ahead on that part of the economy, so it becomes apparent that we are less dependent on oil and gas for our economic stability in the years to come.
So another challenge for journalism there. Jannik Lindbäck, Berman was arguing that big oil companies have been working hard to shape the public debate in different countries. And of course you cannot answer for all oil companies, but also Equinor, you have a big communications department, 150 employees, which is more than many Norwegian newsrooms have journalists. And so obviously you are also working to get your messaging across in the public debate. And the last years we've seen a lot of commercials and campaigns on how you want to become a greener company. Will you say it's been easy for you to get that message across in the Norwegian public debate and the Norwegian press?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I agree with what you just said. The way you describe things, I subscribe to that, and I think that We as a company, we are in a transition. We are developing into something that is better positioned for a low carbon future, and that's our agenda, and that's what we're trying to inform the broader public about. We are coming from a past where oil and gas played a key role in the economy, and we are going into a future where it will have to play a far less important role. We believe there will be some oil and gas for some decades to come, but we as a company, we are looking at how we can fit into a future where we broaden ourselves and enter into far more renewable sources of energy. So that's what we are working, and others, I think, will have to comment on whether our information and the way we participate in the public debate is contributing in the right way to the transition. At least that is our ambition. We are looking at how we can play an active and constructive role in what we believe is necessary to reach the Paris goals, and that's what we're working for. I think that with regards to journalism, I think that we are obviously very fortunate in Norway in the sense that we have an independent and free press. We have news media that are following our industry and the energy and climate topics on a daily basis. And we also have a trade press that is following our industry, not only supporting and celebrating what goes on in the industry, but also monitoring what's going on in terms of transition, in terms of emissions, and doing the job they're supposed to do as journalists and as media. I think in our context, where we have our main operation, which is in Norway, we participate in the public debate and try to engage in a way that is building trust and that is science-based and that is based on what we do. And we believe that media follows us closely, and that we wouldn't get away if we weren't doing what we're saying we're doing.
But as Geir was talking about how he sees the debate has been changing and the focus of journalists have been changing, do you experience that the press covers you differently now than they did a couple of years ago in light of the climate change question?
Yeah, I think these things are changing quite fast, perhaps not fast enough, but I think that, 8-10 years ago, I agree. We had some finds on the Norwegian continental shelf that was celebrated on every front page because it meant that we would secure continued income from the oil and gas industry to the Norwegian state coffers. Now media is monitoring this very differently, and you see it both in the news coverage but also in the commentary. I think also the main more traditional media are covering the industry in a way that is basically critical, and it's monitoring whether we are a force for good or whether we are contributing to prolong the oil and the fossil age, so to say.
Ramnefil, you told me earlier about some reflections you've made on the coverage of the oil crisis package that came now in Norway during COVID-19. There was a tax cut package to the oil and gas sector. And you told me earlier about some reflections you've made on how that package was covered in Norwegian media compared to what you thought it would have been a couple of years ago. What were your reflections?
Yes, well, Sepra was also reflecting a bit on that, the stimulus packages that has been given to oil and gas companies all over the world, and also in Norway. I've been covering oil and gas and climate politics for some years, and I've felt not alone among commentary journalists in the big Norwegian newspapers, but I haven't got all that much support from my views from some of my colleagues in my critical approach. But I felt that this was sort of like a breaking point, because now it's so apparent in Norwegian society and Norwegian politics that we have to start a transition towards other industries to become less dependent on oil and gas in the years to come. And in that picture, this stimulus package for the oil and gas industry, when most people maybe saw that this was like a golden opportunity to throw money towards renewables, towards projects for other parts of the economy that could grow and be like the new oil and gas projects for the future, was wasted, and that the government instead prioritized oil and gas, supporting the old income, the old money, instead of the new. And I got the sense that that was becoming a mainstream view in Norwegian newspapers among my colleagues, and that surprised me actually quite a bit.
And this is a view I guess you're not happy with if this becomes a mainstream.
I mean, I think that there are a couple of different ways of seeing what you're talking about. Because we as a company, we are against fossil fuel subsidies. We believe subsidies has to be removed in order to get where we want and align ourselves in a trajectory towards the Paris Accord. But what happened during the very special situation that appeared with COVID-19 was that the government and the government together with the larger political parties in the parliament found that they couldn't allow the current activity level in the oil and gas industry to plummet because of the COVID-19 situation. So they wanted to uphold the activity that is planned for this year, next year, and the following couple of years, and that's what this package was aimed to do. It isn't really a tax cut; it is a postponement of tax, so that the companies will have to pay this tax when they start producing from these assets that they are developing. So I think that a few years down the road, we will see whether the policy gave the results they were aiming for. But I think there are different views to this, and I don't think that your view is the only truth to this, how this package was intended and how it will work.
I mean, we'll not discuss the pros and cons of the package per se, but the coverage of it is what is in question here. But you had a quick
yes,
reply?
I would just like to say that, of course, my view is the right view. No, I would just like to say that I think that part of the reaction among the commentary was based on the fact that the government they wanted to make up a package for the oil industry to support so that the industry didn't plummet, but it was enforced even more in the parliament. So it was they got a bigger tax break and more subsidies. I'd like to call it that, and that was, I think that was what the commentaries reacted upon. That it pointed towards sort of a political problem in Norway, that the political dynamics in Norway is made up in a way that that really supports the oil industry, and that makes it very difficult to restrain political support towards the oil industry, because it is viewed as so important for our economy and also for employment in Norway. And that also points towards a problem for Norway in the years to come, how to transition when the politicians are not able to and not willing to use their power to shift the transition with the politics they enforce in the government?
Very shortly.
Well, I'd just like to say that I think that although there was a broad consensus behind this crisis package, which is aimed at solving a specific topic where we are today, I think that the general consensus is also that we need to move away from the oil dependence that the Norwegian economy has. So it's more about the pace of change than the direction of change, I think.
And now we're talking about, you're saying the view is important in the public debate of what the politics, how politics is made. You're saying that the general consensus is important, and media also has a role in shaping, the public view, the public debate, and the consensus that we all agree on, if we agree on it. And going back to my first question to you, Jannik, I mean, your attempt or your efforts to also shape this view with your communications. There was a lot of debate last year when Equinor made a commercial and bought space at Aftenposten, the big newspaper. They have a podcast called Forklart, which is kind of the Norwegian version of the New York Times famous daily podcast. And you made a commercial on that podcast where you wanted to show that you want to become a greener company. There was a lot of debate around that podcast and criticism, amongst others, because it was part of Aftenposten's podcast and whether or not this newspaper were lending their legitimacy towards your messaging. They are not here today, so we'll not go into that, but I'm interested in this commercial from Equinor because it sounds like journalism and it looks like journalism and it feels like journalism in a way, this podcast that you made. Why is my question. Why are you moving into this sort of messaging that looks and feels like journalism?
Well, I think that the rationale behind that is, I suppose it's called content marketing, and that's what this was. And we wanted to reach out with communication that departs from the fact that we are facing a dilemma. The world needs more energy, and we have to reduce CO2 emissions. And I think that the way we did it was, at least it was aimed to be balanced, science-based and fact-based. And I think that by doing it, we reached, I think, in the range of 230,000 streams of the podcast, and 60% of the listeners were fairly young. So we achieved what we aimed for. We reached out with information about how we look at this dilemma and how we are trying to play a constructive role in the transition that we see necessary. I think it also was fact-checked by independent media, news media. I think Dagbladet did a job at it, and I don't think there was any things that had to be sort of changed if it had appeared in other media. I think it was factual.
You did do a fact check and a commentary on that podcast,
well, we didn't do a thorough fact check on it. We did a podcast where we had a rough fact check. I would say. First of all, I would say that it wasn't a commercial. It was a whole program sequence. Forklart runs from Monday to Friday. They don't air on Saturdays, and this was aired on Saturday. So it was like a continuation of. So it was sort of like for the viewer or for the listeners. It would be regarded as a part of the series if you didn't pay attention. I guess people paid attention and could listen and view for themselves. But I feel that this podcast is part of Equinor's and earlier Statoil's long-standing long-standing effort to, of course, make a better impression among the public on what they are doing. Earlier, they were doing sponsorships of musicians, of people in like skiers and other athletes, but now the debate has sharpened. They have to address the climate policy and the development as such. And during the last couple of years, we've seen Equinor and Norsk Olje og Gass, which is the lobby organization of Norwegian oil industry, being much more active on social media and also in commercials as this one, trying to influence the public debate on oil and gas industry's role in the future of Norway. Because although Yannick says and Equinor says that they want to reach the Paris goals as much as Norwegian government and climate activists, they also want to explore more oil, and they need political support to explore more oil, and they need also to recruit young new students, young new employers at their company. So they want to reach a young audience. They want to engage a young audience, and we've also seen surveys among young people that young people today have a more positive view towards oil and gas than they had 5 or 10 years ago. So I think that they have actually done a quite good job at influencing the young public on supporting oil's part of the Norwegian economy during the next decades. And I think that is troubling because there is a struggle in Norway, a political struggle, as we saw with the stimulus package, on whether or not the politicians can confront the big dilemma or the big problem for Norway in the next years to diversify, to find new ways of income to our society and not be as dependent on oil and gas. But they have been reluctant to do that in a fast enough way. So this effort from Equinor, I fear that they are contributing to slowing it down.
If I may comment, I think that as a company listed on the stock exchange, owned by the Norwegian government and around 30% other shareholders, we have a legitimate role in communicating what we do, and I think it's media's role to monitor and cover and comment on whether we are doing something that is trustworthy and can be seen as a constructive way of contributing to the transition. So I think the media is doing a good job, at least in Norway. I can't talk for other geographies. And media has an important role to play. And I think that when companies like ours, and it goes to Sephora's point about sort of using the net zero sort of context to take a new position for companies like ours. I think media has to cover us and to follow us and to monitor whether we are delivering on our promises. When we state that we will reduce our climate gas emissions as we did earlier this year, committing to going into the net zero future, monitor us year by year. Look at what we're doing. Look at whether we are developing the company in a way that will either prolong the oil age or shorten it. And use what you have as journalistic tools to follow up on that in an interesting way. I think we've seen over the last couple of years with Greta Thunberg and the mobilization of youth. I think that it is driving a massive amount of attention, and it's very sad that we have this COVID-19 situation coming in and impacting that engagement, because I think that engagement is also driving media in the right direction. And I think that what we're supposed to discuss here is, I suppose, is how media can reach young people with informed coverage that will enable them to engage in a good way. I think that media should take that very seriously, and I think that young people today has showed stark sense of urgency with regards to the climate, and I think that there is something there that media shouldn't only cover through news, but also cover the whole energy and climate dilemma the way you described it, with informed articles about what are the alternatives, how can we actually reach the goals, how can we speed this transition up, what is possible, what does science say, what does technology allow for, what kind of technologies do we need. There's a lot of interesting things going on, and there is a lot of things that we need to do that media can monitor more closely and follow up on.
Just we need to move on in the debate, but just a quick follow-up to you, if Geir Amnefjell, if you think that Equinor is doing a good job in shaping how the youth are thinking about the oil and gas sector, does that mean that journalism is doing a bad job? If you fear that outcome, as you were saying.
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that they are an effective company, and they have good strategies, and they have a lot of resources. And my point is that journalists should be aware of this this campaign and this strategy, and confront it and write about it.
So I guess one key question in this debate is also that whether or not journalists should do more than just state this dilemma and paradox. As you were saying, Lindbäck, Equinor, yourself, you're stating this dilemma and paradox of being a fossil fuel producing independent nation in a global warming world. So the question is, should journalists do more than just describe this dilemma and look at both sides, hear the arguments from Equinor and the government and from the environmental activists? This touches upon some core principles in journalism, whether or not journalism should take a stand. But does journalists also have a role in, judging which side has more right? Not just stating the dilemma, but also judging which one the public should how the public should assess who are right and not. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Question goes to me. Okay. Well, I think that there is a difference there, because it's a very important journalistic principle that you should hear both sides out and treat both sides fairly, and also not be activistic in your news coverage. I think that is a dead end for journalism. If we are viewed by the public as a news outlet as being unfair towards some parts of society or the oil industry, as sort of like a principle in our news coverage, I think that the public will lose interest and lose faith in our news coverage. Having said that, it's also important that commentary articles, debate articles, assess the facts and try to make up an opinion. But that is commentary articles. They are labeled as commentary articles. People can, and they are labeled even more thoroughly now on the internet, so that you don't miss out whether it's a news article or a commentary article. Because of course we have to analyze and take a stand also. assessing what views we mean are right and what we see as the right projection for the future of our society and our economy. And of course, critical journalism has a critical viewpoint, but during a critical news coverage of the oil industry, we have to be fair and balanced, as they say in Fox News. Sorry.
I think I don't disagree at all. I think that obviously this topic of energy and climate, it's an ongoing debate. So the number of opinion editorials might sometimes outnumber the number of news articles on the topic, because things are happening and you need to comment. While you don't necessarily need to cover it, because the coverage is done by others, or there's so much attention around it that so I see that. But I think it's important over a certain time, at least, to have a balance between the interesting, curious news coverage. I'm not saying it shouldn't be critical. I think it should be critical in every article. It should probe, and it should question, and should challenge companies like ours, government, those that have power, those that are powerful in this transition, and really challenge it. But it also needs to be fact-based, science-based, informed, balanced as far as that is possible, so that you make sure that you have different sources. And enable people to feel that they are being taken seriously as readers, not only exposed to the same angle every time.
We could have talked a lot more about that, but I see there are questions ticking in on YouTube. Before we open up for those, I just wanted to bring in Camilla Hodland, who is a researcher at the University of Oslo and part of a project here at Oslo Met. And she's doing her PhD on oil workers' experience of how their own experience of how they're being represented in the media and by their industry in the media. And Camilla, what have you found, and what does that mean for Ramnefjell and Lindbeck here?
Yeah, just first, I'm not a media analyst, but we've had focus groups with unionists from the oil industry in Norway and also in Nigeria, talking about how media cover the dilemma between climate change and the green transition and work. And what they say mainly is that they do not recognize their own industry when they read the media. In their perception, it's the youth and the environmental organizations that dominate the discourse in the media. And then they talk about the national media, not necessarily local media. And I think that's also important to bring along in any discussion on covering climate change and transition, because it's not just a question of closing down industry or continuing as is, but there are social actors here who are winners and losers. And the industry is not just, and I do agree with what has been said about the power of this industry, but there are also social actors, and that is workers, but also consumers, who has been reacting politically. A year ago, we had a campaign initiated by unionists and workers themselves, where they had this online campaign of being proud oil workers. And in that, they wanted also to say that they do work on environmental transitions, and they do not see that in the media. And we can discuss all about these perceptions, but I think it also links to what actors we engage with, not just the industry as such, but workers and others. And last week, the guy who initiated Proud Oil Workers changed his Facebook profile again to Sad Oil Worker. And this also reflects what the workers we talk to have said, that the specific association of oil to something that is problematic and hindrance for a climate change future is also in the way for journalists to cover the actual industry and the working condition that is deteriorating and getting worse by the day. And workers are the ones who are losing jobs, job security and conditions during these crises that we've seen. And they feel that this is not covered because they're associated with something bad. I have to say one more thing, because I think it's absolutely important to say that now we talk in Norway, and even though Equinor is extremely powerful and the industry is very powerful when it comes to creating or influencing policies as well as media, internationally, when I have been to Nigeria, there's hardly any coverage whatsoever of climate change and transition. And the workers themselves say that this is because the industry is so powerful, there are vested interests, and it's dangerous. Climate journalism is one of the first, or climate journalists and environmental activists may be the first in line of oppression, incarcerations, etc., when covering these issues. And I think that also plays back to Norwegian media and Canadian or international media on a responsibility to talk about the global issues of transition.
So I think there was a couple of challenges, especially to Geir Ramnefjell there, on how you cover the oil workers and also whether or not you cover the oil sector in an international perspective.
When it comes to oil workers, couple of years ago, there were a lot of critical articles on whether or not speaking about or criticizing the oil industry is also talking down upon oil workers, and that's not my intention at all. And I don't feel that is the intention of anyone who writes critical about the oil industry in Norway. And as a matter of fact, that's why I personally, and I feel that many other journalists also are very concerned about that, building new technologies, building new industries in Norway so that we create new jobs, create new possibilities for workers in Norway, because it's extremely important to get the workers on board on this transition and make them feel part of the transition as well as the activists and youth organizations. But I feel that we can't stop criticizing oil industry and oil companies and political strategies among the political parties heavily, although it affects oil workers as well. We can't stop doing critical coverage of that as a result of perspectives like that. We have to do several things at the same time. We have to write different articles covering that perspective as well, because I feel that is very, very important. And when it comes to international focus, your point is very good. I feel many times that if I was working in a newspaper in
Nigeria,
for example, I would be in jail. So, or I would not write the articles, because I totally understand the power and the struggle journalists must endure in countries with a less open society and not the same democratic traditions as we have in Norway. I feel that is the most important base for the critical debate we have in Norway. That we have an open press, that we can criticize Equinor in such a way that we do, and I feel that the critics, when it comes to resources, are so much less powerful than industry, than the political parties that support them. So when you see that in perspective, the only thing that is actually supporting us is the principle of government, and that shows how important. So we should cover that more. I totally agree.
Lindbeck, you'll get the chance. I just wanted to quickly add another question from the YouTube chat that is directly associated with what you are talking about now, Geir, which is that a question from Lars. Equinor is quite clear on the need to change towards a fossil-free future. Perhaps this could be better communicated by journalists. This would make it easier for politicians to support the transition and not keep the fossil industry alive for so long that it becomes a problem for Norway. A question. Are you good enough to make that come across?
Yes, I think that if Equinor didn't develop as a company, the criticism of the company would be much more severe. They are trying to transition. They are developing new projects, but they are also eager to invest and to explore on more oil and gas in the northern parts of Norway, which is a big political debate. So I feel that even though they are transitioning, there are many things to criticize the company for. So you can't stop criticizing them just because they are on a path towards transition. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
So I'd like to start by the comment that you made on and the interesting research that you have from oil workers. In general, I think that the broad range of people working in the industry, I think across that population, they understand the need for change, and they understand that we need to transition. But I think for some it's harder than for others, and people feel a job insecurity and all that, and we need to take that seriously. But I think it's primarily a job that we as a company will have to do, and we as an industry, because we will have to also listen to our own people and communicate to them about what we need to do and how we're going to do it, and how that also can include the current workers and make room for them into the transition. So I think that is something, and that is important. And we obviously need to attract new people. And you talked about the way the campaigns that we do to young people coming out of university and all that. And that is to attract people to our industry. And you can't fool those people. I mean, if they come into our company and see that we're not doing what we're saying, they will just leave. They're intelligent people, and that's part of what's driving change, is that we are a part of society, and we are exposed to opinions also from our own employees, and driving change means listening also to our own employees, and so I think that's what's going on.
We're almost running out of time here. I want to include one last question from the YouTube chat. We were speaking on how we can do more international coverage or increase the link. And one question here is that Equinor, as many other oil companies, have production in several countries. But coverage of Equinor's production abroad is almost absent in the Norwegian media. How can journalists treat the Norwegian dilemma as an international dilemma? I guess this goes to you, Ramnefjell.
Almost absent, I think, if you...
Almost absent, yes. There's been some coverage of the US activities, and also about Angola. So there has been some coverage. The big problem there is resources, I would say. Yes, Australia as well. Okay, we can any more. There's been not extensive and thorough coverage.
Still?
Not as extensive and thorough as it could have been. But I think that boils down to lack of resources for the news media. And during the last 10 years, we've been experiencing a downfall in our circulation, and we don't have as much resources to travel to specialize in that direction as we would like to do.
Could you cooperate with the journalists in those countries, for example? Is that
That's
something?
a good idea. I'll write it down. Thank you.
I mean, and now we also have a list of countries that you were kind of saying that where you have problems, if I understood you correctly.
But that's not only journalists. Like when it comes to Australia, it was many activists and those sorts of people in Australia covering it, and I guess that has been a fact in other places as well.
Absolutely. No, I think that Norwegian media is very good at covering Equinor, both at home but also abroad when we do things that are sort of reaching the headlines. But I'm sure they can do more, and that there's more interesting coverage to look for. I think that the point that I would like to mend towards the end is based on what you just said about resources. I think it's really worrisome that news media have less and less resources, that more and more attention is driven through Facebook and other global channels, and that is really threatening the base and the foundation for critical journalism to monitor what this industry and society is doing. I think that is a general problem, and also how to reach out to young audiences that they didn't grow up with opening the newspaper in the morning to look for news. They're searching elsewhere, and how do we make sure that we reach them with good journalism? I think that is a key topic. It's a very broad topic, but I think that's a real challenge.
I was going to propose that you can give some of your 150 communications officers to Geir, but of course it doesn't work that way.
It is sponsored Aftenposten through content marketing, so...
Good enough, good enough. Well, now we have an open invitation for international journalists to cover the oil sector in Equinor in other countries, together with Geir Amnefjell here. And you also invite critical coverage, which we are happy to hear, Jannik Lindbäck. We have to call it a day for this debate, at least. One plug-in for Camilla, who were speaking about the oil workers. There's another debate specifically on oil workers later today in the program, as you will see. You need to log on into a Zoom room. But for now, we have a short break, and one will be back with a talk from James Painter in 10-12 minutes on how we can proceed, what is the state of the research on climate change journalism today, and what needs to be done. So welcome back in the stream in 12 minutes time. Thank you to both of you for showing up.
Thank you.
So, welcome back to the last stream part of this conference. It is not the end of the conference as such. There's paper sessions and some discussion sessions after lunch. And those of you who have registered would already have information about that. But this is the last part of the YouTube stream that we're going to have. And I'm very happy to introduce to you James Painter, who is going to do a talk on the development of climate journalism research, something that he's been researching himself. He participated with various questions yesterday, as some of you saw, and James has been part of the organizing committee for this conference and really helped us show that this meeting point between academics looking into climate journalism, the fast developing field of climate journalism, and practitioners, the BBC and the NRK, as we saw yesterday, that this is an important meeting point, and this has been a large point of having this web-based conference. So, James, I'm going to let you do the rest of the speaking. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Good. I'm just going to make sure that you can see the presentation as well. Can you see it?
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So thanks very much, Andreas. As Andreas said, my name is James Painter. I'm a research associate at the Reuters Institute at Oxford, but I was a journalist for several years at the BBC. I'm going to talk mostly about the current state of climate journalism research, but I will mention at the end some ideas to build on some of the themes that were discussed yesterday about the practice of climate journalism, which I think would be worthy of some further reflection. I'm going to go quite fast, but don't worry, because I'm very happy to share this presentation. So this is, to start with, a fairly shameful moment of self-promotion, but I do think it will help the discussion. This is a paper that we published in Wires a couple of months ago, which is called Climate Journalism in a Changing Media Ecosystem. I published it with Mike Schaefer, and it does attempt to summarize all the scholarship, the recent scholarship on climate journalism, and identify things that we know and don't know. One thing to stress is that we did focus mostly on published peer-reviewed scholarship, but we did make a huge effort to seek out publications on climate journalism in the Global South. And we asked colleagues with area-specific expertise for recommendations. So there's quite a lot around the Global South. And we ended up examining about 140 articles or book chapters. Please do go and read it. We've had some good responses and things that pointed out things that we've missed. So please, if you do have a moment and you're interested in this space, then go and read it. I think you can get it on a free download. If you can't, just email me. So this is a pictorial representation of what we were trying to do. If you can see in the top left-hand column, part of the picture, different national contexts and different media systems. But what this pictorial representation tries to do is to show the sort of three areas that we were looking at. The first was the context of journalism in crisis. That's the declining resources from advertising in particular for mainstream or legacy media. As we know, something like 70 to 80% of new digital advertising is going to Facebook, Amazon, and Google, which is probably the main reason why so many mainstream organizations, media organizations, are in trouble. Then we've got the rise of online social media and the pluralization of voices, which you'll be familiar with. And then in the middle, the three areas that we really tried to focus down on: the organizational makeup, the role, perceptions, and performance. In particular, discussions about advocacy reporting, which is so relevant now and was discussed yesterday a little bit, and then relationship with sources. the key point that we were trying to stress was the greater need to root the research into climate journalism, both conceptually and empirically, more in these fundamental changes in the media ecosystems. We're not completely convinced that all scholars are anchoring their research enough in these tectonic shifts. So, for example, as we will see in a minute, the digital news report from the Reuters Institute of 2020, which came out a couple of months ago, showed that printed newspapers have dropped below conversations with friends and families as a source of news about climate change. And yet, much of the scholarship in the past, for reasons which we know, have focused on print. And so we're making the case that we really do have to delve down into these structural factors with a little bit more attention. I'm going to go very fast, but here are some of the conclusions. The organizational embedding of climate change, of climate journalism is changing, with specialist reporters becoming scarce and working under more strenuous conditions, having to work on more platforms. However, I should stress that this is what the research says, but there have been huge changes. Some people say tectonic changes in climate coverage, particularly in the Anglophone world in the last 12 to 18 months. Which hasn't, of course, yet been examined by scholarship. But we have the Covering Climate Now initiative. Max Boykoff yesterday was talking about this huge pickup in volume prior to COVID. We have the Washington Post and New York Times dedicating more resources. We heard yesterday about the BBC and NLK. The Guardian, of course, is a leader, pumping out stuff on climate change. And for those of you interested, there's even a piece today in The Guardian saying how much impact their climate coverage has had on policy in other areas. So even though that first point is true as far as the research agenda says, it hasn't really caught up with these big changes. The second point is the emergence of online-born news media and niche sites, which I'll return to, which are much more popular than you would imagine as a source of climate information for wider populations. And then the third point is a lot of the literature discusses this shift in the roles available to climate journalists from what they call gatekeeping. That's the old type of top-down provision of information for audiences, whereby the journalist assumes the primary responsibility for selecting topics and information and putting it out there. And now many journalists, climate journalists, are more involved in what we call curating, or what scholarship calls curating. That's they find relevant content, restructure it, presented it without added evaluation, and directed at their key audiences.
James, could I just pop in with a short question to you on that?
Of course.
On that last point, because yesterday BBC and NRK, and just earlier today we heard Dagbladet, the Norwegian paper, talk in a way very classically about the role of the journalist, that we are informing on the news channel, and then the commentary we can have some subjectivity and so on, then we have opinions and so on. So could you say a little bit more about what you mean by curating in a kind of in a language that journalists themselves would kind of understand?
All right, fair enough. I think remember, this is rooted in what the research says, what scholarship says, and I think what they would, at the risk of oversimplifying it, what they're saying is that in the olden days, journalists would get the information and disseminate it to their audiences in a sort of top-down way. Now there is much more information out there from various sources. And even though a big chunk of what journalists do is still covering news and breaking news, an awful lot of other type of journalism is about selecting what the relevant content is and restructuring it and presenting it with an added evaluation, which can be often opinion forming. In other words, there's been this diversification of roles that journalists play beyond just reporting the news. It's sort of adding that, because so many people are just reporting the news, other journalistic outlets are thinking, well, what's the added value that we give this particular piece of news? What does it mean, for example? What impact might it have? Is that a decent enough explanation?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so moving on, just quickly, there's a lot of research around climate journalists' relationship with their sources. And one of the main conclusions was that second point, that elite sources are still very important. But of course, there's a much broader range of stakeholders. It was interesting, just as an anecdote, that I was discussing with one of my former students, who's now a lead journalist on GRIST in the United States, about her relationship with sources. And her view is that, at least in her case, journalists are more dependent on elite sourcing as opposed to individual citizens or people on the ground, because journalists often no longer work in their communities and areas they're reporting on. And she says, the issue really is, I travel the world or the country by phone. That has some advantages, but I don't have the resources, particularly in the COVID era, to spend it on the ground, meeting real people. So I think elite sources still are terribly important. And one of the other conclusions is there's a strong and rising influence of stakeholder public relations on climate journalism. It'd be very interesting to hear what journalists think about that. And I was very surprised and interested by this research by Rachel Wetz that came out just a couple of months ago on the influence of business groups in the US elite media, at least until 2014. And her conclusion was rather extraordinary, that messages from business coalitions and large businesses are more likely than those from other type of organization to receive coverage. I really recommend you go and see it, even though it is the US and it stops at 2014. But she concluded that press releases opposing action to address climate change are twice as likely to be cited in those newspapers as press releases advocating for climate action. It'd be really interesting to know whether that has changed. As I mentioned, we did a lot around the Global South. I think it's well known. There's been a lot of research showing that over half of the publications in English and academic journals have been about the USA. And only 6%, for example, according to one report, analysed China. And the numbers for Brazil and India are also very low. We heard from Media Climate Initiative yesterday. I'm very proud to be affiliated with that. They're the difference. I think they're the one exception where they do a lot of research around other developing countries, and it would be nice to see more of that getting published in academic journals. The third point I really feel strongly about, we actually know quite a lot now about how media landscapes are changing in India, China, Brazil, particularly in this exponential growth in the use of mobile phones to access news online. But scholarship on how these changes are affecting climate journalism is very scarce. And finally, again, a point that's been often stressed in developing countries, climate change is often viewed by editors as an international story, and local reporting is not prioritized. And there's been a lot of good research showing how often international sources and news agencies are much more relied on than, say, in a country like Norway or the UK. If you're not aware of this, please go and read it. This is the latest report I mentioned earlier by the Reuters Institute on how people get access to news. There's a lot on young people's access to news and who they pay most attention to, or which platform they pay most attention to. It's not just the global north. Several countries of the global south were included, 40 countries in all. And there you can see your top line, 35% use television. Remember, that's not television, just news. It's also documentaries, followed by online news sites, which you would probably predict of major news organizations. The third one I think is really interesting. Specialist outlets covering climate issues. That's 13% use that as they pay most attention to it. Social media posts or blogs, at least this is self-declared responses, were not that as important as I would have thought. And then, as I mentioned earlier, print and radio really becoming further and further down. But please, it's a free download. Do go and look at it. Just briefly, this is slightly, again, self-promotional, but I'm involved in a project led by Risto Cornelius at the University of Helsinki. And we're looking at these climate niche sites, partly prompted by that figure of just how many people are using them. And you've only got to start looking at some of these ones on the screen, and you realize all sorts of really fascinating things around the differences between them, the role perceptions that journalists who work for them, are they advocates or are they doing journalism, the changing nature of climate communication, their relationship with scientists and policymakers, the different areas of expertise that they offer. And it's not just the Anglophone countries, there are several in China and India. And I would strongly recommend that this is an area of research that would be fascinating to delve down more into. Just finally summarizing some of the research gaps which we found. Again, the first one is not new, but it's worth reiterating. Broadcast and online journalism, which have a much wider audience, are not analyzed as often as print. It's as I mentioned earlier, this focus on print is disproportionate to their importance as sources of news. I think the second one is really important. We heard from Toby yesterday about the importance of visuals. There's so many reasons why visuals and audio visuals are important to investigate with much more detail and nuance, particularly in the light of, we know from the research about how images on particularly Instagram and Snapchat are so important for the impact, the reach and engagement of news on social media. We need much more analysis, but not just social media, but also issues like the role of weather forecasters. There's some interesting research done in the US and now Australia on how they play an increasingly important role of contextualizing the weather. So there's a lot of area of research that we could helpfully have more of. The third point is made again by several people, but a lot of the work that's done is based on surveys of journalists or interviews, and it would be really nice to have more closely focused ethnographic research and participant observation. But the fourth point, again, is the one I stressed at the beginning, that although it's difficult to establish robust causal links between the sort of big macro changes and how it affects climate journalism, I think more emphasis on that relationship could provide sort of insights into that sort of muddy area, but fascinating area of the relationship between these macro trends of what's happening to business models of media organizations, the organizational mezzo level and the micro level of journalism, which includes everything from values and their perception of their roles. So here, just to finish, are some areas of climate, of the practice of climate journalism, but also it sort of bleeds into research areas as well, which may be worth thinking about. The big picture, I think, is that several people mentioned yesterday, climate change needs to be the background to more stories in the same way that COVID-19 now is the background to so many business stories or sports stories or obviously health stories. It would be great if there was more contextualization and relationship to climate change. And secondly, I think the big picture that's changed in the last 2 or 3 years is that for many audiences, climate change is not something that happens to people out there in the developing world or to polar bears. It's really happening in the global north as well. We wrote a piece for Neiman a couple of months ago. They headline its 5 tips. We presented it more as just 5 things to think about, many of which are mentioned yesterday. The focus on the relevance to everyday life, expanding the climate change stories away from the environmental beat, emphasizing potential solutions, highlighting the visual and making it local. The second one, animal agriculture and climate change. Again, it's slightly an area that I'm very interested in, but I think lots of other people are becoming interested in. Historically, animal agriculture and its role in emissions, which are roughly the same as transport, has had much less coverage than you would imagine. But that's changing quite radically. And I think that's a really important area that journalists and researchers could fruitfully concentrate more on. It's happening a bit. The Guardian has launched a special index called Animals Farmed. Carbon Brief did a great 5-part series. The BBC is doing much more on it, but that's something to look at and research. Solutions journalism, a lot of people have been talking about that because it's it speaks to the whole debate about doom and gloom stories versus stories of hope. But again, there's not much academic research on it. local reporting is probably the biggest challenge, given the cuts to local reporting in many parts of the world, particularly the USA. And yet we know, for example, just last week, the latest survey work from Yale, George Mason, showing that people in the US are very interested both in how climate change is affecting local communities and what local communities could do about it. Then finally, extreme weather event reporting. This is a map that Carbon Beef published recently about all the various extreme weather events that have happened and have been subject to what the scientists call extreme event attribution studies. This is by which, for ages, journalists used to say, well, we can't say that climate change had a particular role in this extreme weather event. That, of course, is now changing. You can say, not that it was caused by climate change, but it was made more or less likely or more or less severe. And this is particularly true of the Global South as well as the Global North. There are studies of the Global South as well. And I think that's a real area of both where journalists can do a better role in really following the latest science and being in touch with climate attribution scientists, but also thinking about how you pictorially represent heat waves, for example, is always something to be enjoyed. Of course, they are to be enjoyed in some sense, but they're also very dangerous and can have very deleterious effects. So I think that's something really worth thinking about and researching. So that's a very rapid tour of the horizon of the climate research and some things to think about in the practice of journalism. This is my email. Do email me if there's anything that I went over too quickly or you want a copy of the WIRES research that we did. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, James. Well, I've read your article with Mike, and it's a so-called advanced literature review, which is true. I mean, it's really going through a lot of the research and really demonstrating how climate journalism is becoming an academic field in its own right, which complements this conference excellently. So thank you so much, James, for that talk. I'm going to close off, but there's a question from Torsten Schäfer, James, that you may want to address shortly here. Is there research about linking the analysis of environmental and nature journalism as well as nature writing and climate change journalism? Are there any studies about the climate context of British nature writing, for instance, he asks?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm not aware of it. It's certainly not something that's, stares out at you when you start looking at doing the literature search, but it's something that I think would be a fruitful area to look at. I would be surprised if there was research on that link, although I don't know what it's like in your countries, but certainly in the UK, there's a real boom in nature writing and the particularly around COVID actually as well, and the sort of healing effects of the mental health benefits, but all sorts of other angles as well. So yes, in answer to your question, no, I'm not aware of it, but yes, it's an interesting area of research.
Thank you. And now I'll close off. I won't have a long closing remark speech, but I'll make a confession. It's not a mind-blowing confession, and for those who have gone to academic conferences, it's not a particularly surprising confession. But I go to conferences because I want to meet people in person. The presentations and everything are really important, but the networking is the main part of it. And obviously, the COVID-19 restrictions made that we could not have this meeting point between researchers and practitioners and all the coffee drinking and other types of drinking that would have kind of led to more links being made. And particularly so since a part of the audience for this web conference is my own students. We have all looked forward to sitting here, in COVID secure environment. Every third chair in the auditorium in front of me is supposed to have somebody there, and instead there's just a few people there. But having said that, I think from the comments along yesterday and today that we did manage to make some sort of fork in the road of putting together the stakeholders or researchers and practitioners and focusing particularly on the engagement of young people. So we will make available the videos and I know part of those you've listening, been working, couldn't follow the entire thing. We'll try to divide up the different sections so that we can distribute it in various channels. We'll also try to make available presentations, links, as soon as we can on our Oslo Met website. So we will keep in touch. We don't know when we will meet physically for the next time, but we have established some links that I think are important in the future. I also want to, in closing, well, let me reiterate once again, we're not closing off the conference entirely. We have a paper session, we have a discussion forum after lunch, and for those of you following now who have not pre-registered, you can follow some of those sessions. If you go into the website of Improving Climate Journalism at Oslo Met, you can see the Zoom links for what will happen from 12:30 onwards. But in closing off the stream, I would like to thank, well, James was part of the organizing committee, but the organizing committee for this conference has been important to make this happen, and I would like to highlight particularly those who have given the physical applause here in the auditorium, Ingrid Salvesen and Ingrid Fadnes, who has been the key drivers for this conference ever since this spring. So they can't make the applause for themselves here, but I have two other people in the room. We are applauding, and I am certainly applauding your work. You've been doing really great work, and to be able to pull this off was really great. So thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Ingrid, for doing all of this. So, without any more words from me, let me just close off this stream. Thank you so much for watching. Do keep following on our Oslo Met website, the research group, Media, Environment and Society, the Media Climate Network, who is also co-organizing this conference, are both also searchable on the grand internet. Thank you so much.